In the unforgiving West, a woman's fate was often a contract signed in desperation. For Rosalind Hayes, that contract was meant to lead to a respectable, if loveless, life as the wife of a wealthy man in Redemption, Arizona. It was a bargain made to save her family from ruin. But before the ink was dry, before her bags were even packed in her dreary Missouri town, a man with eyes the color of the desert at dusk staked a claim no piece of paper could ever grant. He was a tracker, an outcast the townsfolk whispered about, and his words spoken in a low, certain voice were a brand on her soul. You are mine. This is the story of a promise made and a destiny seized from the very jaws of fate. The dust of Harmony Creek, Missouri, had a taste all its own, a gritty blend of failed crops, lost hope, and the fine, silty earth that clung to everything. For Rosalind Hayes, it was the taste of her entire 22 years. It coated the back of her throat as she stood on the rickety porch of the farmhouse, the letter from Redemption, Arizona, clutched in her hand. The paper was crisp and expensive, a stark contrast to the splintered wood beneath her worn-out boots. It smelled of ink and money, two things in desperately short supply since her father's passing last winter. Her brother Walter stood at the base of the steps, his shoulders slumped with the weight of a man twice his age. The farm, their father's legacy, was dying. The well was running low, the creditors were circling like buzzards, and Walter's pride was fraying with each passing day. It's the only way, Rosie, he said, not looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the parched cornfield, its stalks brittle and yellowed. Mr. Thorne is a man of means. He can give you a life I can't. He's settled his affairs, paid for your passage. It's a respectable arrangement. A respectable arrangement, that's what they called it. A mail-order bride. A transaction. She would trade her future for a paid-off mortgage and a clear deed for Walter. She would become Mrs. Bartholomew Thorne, a name she'd only ever seen in neat, forceful script at the bottom of a letter. He had seen a photograph of her, a stiff and solemn portrait, taken by a traveling photographer. In his reply, he had written that she possessed a suitable countenance for a woman of station. He wrote of his sprawling ranch, his influence in the territory, his desire for an heir to carry on his name. He wrote of everything but love. Rosalind smoothed the letter. Suitable. That's what she was. A suitable solution to two men's problems. I know Walter. She whispered the words, tasting of that ever-present dust. I've already agreed. Later that afternoon, needing to escape the suffocating air of the farmhouse, Rosalind walked the familiar path toward Miller's Ridge. It was the only place where Harmony Creek almost looked beautiful, where the setting sun could paint the bleak landscape in hues of rose and gold. It was her sanctuary, the one place she felt like more than just a problem to be solved. She didn't hear him approach. He moved like the shadows he so often occupied, a silent presence that was simply there. She only knew he was near when a twig snapped softly to her left. Her heart gave a jolt that was equal parts alarm and a strange, forbidden thrill. Kyle, she breathed, turning. He stood by a cluster of blackjack oaks, leaning against a trunk with a deceptive casualness that failed to hide the coiled energy within him. Kyle was a man caught between two worlds. His father had been a white trapper, his mother, a woman from a proud tribe far to the south, a fact the good people of Harmony Creek never let him forget. They called him half-breed, a name they spat like a curse. But when a child was lost in the woods or livestock vanished into the hills, he was the first man they sought. Kyle the tracker. Kyle who saw the world in a language of broken branches and faint impressions in the dirt that no one else could read. He had eyes that seemed to hold the vast, lonely expanse of the plains, They were a deep, startling amber, and right now they were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. He said nothing for a long moment, simply watching her, his expression unreadable. "You've been avoiding me," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. His voice was low and resonant, a rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air between them. "I've been busy," Rosalind offered, weakly gesturing vaguely back toward the farm. His lips, thin and firm, quirked in a humorless smile. "Packing." Again a fact. He knew everything that happened in this town, it seemed. He saw the whispers, read the worried glances. She lowered her gaze to the letter still in her hand. "It's for the best." Best for who, he challenged, pushing off the tree and taking a step closer. He moved with a predator's grace, fluid and deliberate. "For your brother. For the man in Arizona who buys a wife like he buys cattle." He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could smell the scent of pine and leather that always clung to him. "Is it best for you, Rosalind?" The sound of her name on his lips was different. Walter said it with weary affection. The townspeople said it with pity. When Kyle said it, it sounded like a secret, a possession. Her throat went dry. "You don't understand," she stammered. "There are debts. The farm." "Walter, I understand obligation," Cale cut in his voice, dangerously soft. "But a life is not a debt to be paid." Their connection was a thing of silence and stolen glances. He had never courted her, never spoken a poetic word, yet in the years since they'd grown from children into adults, an unspoken understanding had woven itself between them. A moment by the creek where he'd shown her a hawk's nest. A shared look over a crowded town social where she'd felt more seen by him in that single glance than she had by anyone else, her entire life. It was a fragile, unacknowledged thing, a wildflower growing in the cracks of her bleak existence. A flower she was now about to trample underfoot. "The decision is made," she said, her voice firmer now, a desperate attempt to convince herself as much as him. "I leave on the morning stage." He closed the remaining distance between them. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a physical force, raising the fine hairs on her arms. He looked down at the letter in her hand. Then his amber eyes lifted to meet hers. They burned with a fire that stripped away all her pretenses, all her talk of duty and obligation, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. "They call you a mail-order bride," he said, his voice a low, guttural murmur. He reached out not to touch her, but to gently take the letter from her nerveless fingers. He didn't read it. He simply held it, as if weighing the paper against the truth. "A man in Arizona calls you his betrothed." He let the letter drop to the dusty ground between them. "But I called you mine, long before he ever knew your name." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a declaration, a statement of an unassailable fact, as certain as the sun's rise. He saw her not as a solution or a commodity, but as a territory he had already claimed in his own silent, profound way. Before she could process the shock, before she could form a single word of protest or question, he turned and melted back into the shadows of the oaks, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. Rosalind stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the ridge into twilight. The letter from Bartholomew Thorne lay at her feet, a pale square in the gathering dark, suddenly feeling as flimsy and meaningless as a dead leaf. The wind whispered through the dry grass, and it seemed to carry his words back to her, a haunting refrain that would follow her all the way to Arizona. Mine. The journey west was a relentless assault on the senses. The stagecoach was a cramped, rattling box of misery, lurching over rutted trails that seemed determined to shake the very bones from her body. Days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of jarring motion, the taste of alkaline dust and the oppressive unending heat. Missouri's gentle green hills gave way to the stark, brutal beauty of the plains, which in turn yielded to the scorched red rock landscapes of the Arizona Territory. It was a land that did not care for softness or sentiment. It was raw, powerful, and utterly indifferent to the small human dramas that played out upon its surface. When the stage finally crested a sun-baked mesa and the driver called out, "Redemption," Rosalind felt not relief but a fresh wave of anxiety. The town was larger than she'd expected, a collection of adobe and wood-frame buildings huddled along a wide, dusty main street. It baked under the fierce sun, a lonely outpost of civilization in a vast, empty wilderness. But what dominated the view, sitting on a rise overlooking the town like a king on his throne, was a magnificent two-story ranch house. It was built of dark timber and river stone, with a wide veranda and glass windows that glittered like diamonds in the harsh light. It was, she knew instantly, the home of Bartholomew Thorne. A man was waiting as she stiffly descended from the coach, her grey travelling dress coated in a fine layer of red dust. He was tall and broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 40s, with a commanding presence that seemed to draw all the air around him. His hair was thick and dark, with distinguished streaks of silver at the temples. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, a startling sight in the rustic town. His face was handsome in a severe, chiseled way, but his eyes, a pale, cold grey, assessed her with an unnerving detachment. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried easily over the street noise. He did not smile. "I am Bartholomew Thorne. Welcome to Redemption." He took her bags from the driver with an air of ownership, his movements precise and economical. There was no warmth in his greeting, only a formal acknowledgement of her arrival. This was the man whose name now held her future, the man whose ring she would wear, whose children she was expected to bear. And in his cool, appraising gaze, she felt the same chilling finality she'd felt when signing the contract. The house was even more imposing up close. Inside, it was a world away from the dust and heat. Polished hardwood floors gleamed, covered with rich Persian rugs. The furniture was heavy and dark, intricately carved mahogany and leather. A grand staircase swept upwards to the second floor. It was a monument to wealth and power, but it was utterly silent. The air was still and cool, and her footsteps echoed unnervingly in the grand entryway. It felt less like a home and more like a museum. A stern-faced woman in a severe black dress and a crisp white apron appeared as if from nowhere. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. "This is Mrs. Gable Thorne," announced without looking at the woman. "She is my housekeeper. She will show you to your room. You will wish to freshen up before supper." "Mrs." Gable gave Rosalind a single sweeping glance that missed nothing and approved of very little. "This way, miss," she said, her voice thin and reedy. Her room was luxurious, with a large four-poster bed, a rosewood vanity, and curtains of heavy velvet. A pitcher of cool water and a basin already sat waiting. From her window she could see the entire town of Redemption spread out below, and beyond it, the endless expanse of the desert shimmering in the heat. It was a beautiful view, but it felt like the view from a prison tower. She was isolated, elevated, and utterly alone. Supper was a tense, formal affair. They sat at opposite ends of a long, polished dining table that could have easily seated 20. Mrs. Gable served them in silence, her movements soundless on the thick rugs. Thorne spoke of his holdings, his cattle, his mining interests. his plans for a rail spur to connect Redemption to the main line. He spoke of his legacy, his ambition, and the importance of order and discipline in building a life of substance. "A man's home is his kingdom, Miss Hayes," he said, pinning her with his grey eyes. "And his wife is his queen. She must be above reproach, a model of grace and dignity. She is a reflection of his own standing." Rosalind murmured her agreement, pushing a piece of roasted beef around her plate. She was not to be a partner then, but a possession, an ornament to be displayed, a testament to his success. The gilded cage was even more confining than she had imagined. The days that followed fell into a rigid, suffocating routine. Thorne was gone from sunup until late in the evening, managing his vast empire. Rosalind was left in the silent house with the disapproving Mrs. Gable as her only companion. She was given no duties, no purpose. She was expected to read quietly, practice her needlepoint, and be ready to provide pleasant, deferential company for Thorne in the evenings. He began to subtly mould her. He bought her new clothes, dresses of silk and lace that were far too fine for a town like Redemption. He corrected her speech, gently chiding her for a dropped consonant or a turn of phrase he deemed too provincial. He instructed her on which townspeople were worthy of a greeting and which were to be ignored. It was all done with a calm, unassailable politeness that was more terrifying than any outburst of anger. He was not breaking her will. He was simply sanding it away, smoothing her down into the shape he desired. One sweltering afternoon, desperate for air, she ventured into the town. It was a different world from the sterile perfection of Thorne's mansion. The air was thick with the smell of horse manure, cheap whiskey, and frying food. Cowboys swaggered along the boardwalks, their spurs jingling. Miners, caked in red dust, drank sullenly in the shade of the saloon's awning. Women in faded gingham dresses hurried about their errands, casting curious, resentful glances at the fine lady from the house on the hill. She found herself near the livery stable, the only place that felt remotely familiar, smelling of hay and honest work. And then she saw him. He was leaning against a corral fence, speaking in low tones to a Mexican man. It was Cale. Her breath caught in her throat. It was impossible. He was a phantom from another life, a ghost from the Missouri hills. Yet there he was, solid and real under the brutal Arizona sun. He wore the same buckskin trousers and worn cotton shirt, but he seemed different here. More dangerous, more at home in the harsh landscape. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up. His amber eyes met hers across the dusty street. There was no surprise in them, only that same unnerving certainty she remembered from Miller's Ridge. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement that this was not a chance meeting. He had followed her. Panic and a wild, terrifying hope surged through her. He was here, but his presence wasn't a comfort. It was a complication that could unravel her fragile, precarious existence. She turned quickly, her heart pounding, and hurried back toward the cold sanctuary of the house on the hill. She could feel his eyes on her back the entire way, a tangible heat that had nothing to do with the sun. The gilded cage had just become infinitely more dangerous, because now the wilderness was looking in. Life in Bartholomew Thorne's house continued its suffocating rhythm, but now a frantic, secret energy hummed beneath Rosalind's placid exterior. The knowledge that Cale was nearby, somewhere in the dusty streets of Redemption, or the vast wilderness beyond, was a constant, unsettling presence. It was a spark of hope in the suffocating darkness, but a spark that threatened to ignite the whole carefully constructed edifice of her new life. Thorne, for his part, seemed pleased with his purchase. Rosalind was quiet, obedient, and beautiful in the expensive gowns he provided. He paraded her through town on Sunday mornings for church, his hand resting proprietarily on the small of her back. He introduced her to the town's sycophantic elite, the banker Mr. Sterling, whose nervousness around Thorne suggested a deep financial obligation, and the town's lawman, Sheriff Brodie, a burly man with a florid face and eyes that were both lazy and cruel. They all treated Thorne with a cloying deference that bordered on fear. Sheriff Brodie understands the importance of order, Thorne commented one evening as they returned from a town council meeting. He ensures my interests, and by extension, the town's prosperity are protected. Rosalind was beginning to understand that Thorne's interests and the town's prosperity were one and the same, and that his definition of order was absolute control. She started listening more closely to the snippets of conversation. She overheard the veiled comments from shopkeepers, the resentful stares from the Mexican and native families who lived on the town's fringes. There were whispers of land deals that were too good to be true, of water rights, mysteriously changing hands of miners being driven from their claims by threats and intimidation. All the whispers, like threads in a spider's web, led back to the man who sat at the head of her dinner table each night. Her chance to see Cale again came a week later. Thorne had ridden out to one of his northern cattle camps and was not expected back until after nightfall. The freedom, however brief, was intoxicating. Under the pretense of buying thread at the mercantile, Rosalind slipped out of the house, ignoring the suspicious glare of Mrs. Gable. She didn't have to look for him. As she walked along the edge of town, near the path that led down to the muddy creek, he was simply there, stepping out from behind a stand of cottonwood trees. "He's poisoning this place," Kyle said, his voice low, dispensing with any greeting. Rosalind's heart hammered against her ribs. "What are you doing here, Kyle? If he finds you—" "He won't," Kyle stated with confidence. "His men are loud and clumsy. They look for trouble in the saloons. They don't know how to look for shadows." He took a step closer, his amber eyes scanning her face, taking in the fine dress, the carefully styled hair. "He's putting his brand on you just like he does his cattle." The crude comparison stung mostly because it was true. I had no choice. "There is always a choice," he countered, his voice sharp. "You chose your brother's comfort over your own life." The accusation hung in the hot, still air. She wanted to argue to defend her sacrifice, but the words wouldn't come. What was her life here but a slow suffocation? "Why did you follow me?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away from her, his gaze sweeping over the dusty town and lingering on the imposing house on the hill. When he looked back, the anger in his eyes was ancient and deep-seated. "This land," he began, his voice dropping to a low growl. "It does not belong to him. Before redemption was a town, before Thorne put his name on it, my mother's people lived by this creek. They were peaceful. They hunted. They farmed. Then men like Thorne came with their pieces of paper from a government 1,000 miles away that claimed to own the sun and the sky. They said the land was theirs." Rosalind listened, transfixed by the raw pain in his voice. "Thorne was smarter than the others," Cale continued. "He didn't use soldiers at first. He used promises. He offered deals. Then he diverted the water from the upper creek for his cattle, and their crops withered. He brought in miners whose tailings poisoned the lower pools. When they were weak and desperate, he offered to buy their land for pennies, calling it mercy. My grandfather refused. He was a proud man." Kyle's jaw tightened a muscle, flexing in his cheek. A week later, he was found dead at the bottom of a ravine. Sheriff Brodie called it a hunting accident. A cold dread seeped into Rosalind's bones. This wasn't just about a stolen glance or a whispered claim on her soul back in Missouri. Kyle's presence in redemption was a quest for vengeance. "He is a patient wolf," Kyle said, his eyes boring into hers. He takes everything piece by piece until there is nothing left. He took their land. He took their water. And he took you. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She was not just an unhappy bride in a loveless marriage. She was a pawn in a generational war, the latest acquisition of a ruthless man. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I want you to open your eyes," he said, his intensity startling her. You are inside his fortress. You hear what he says, you see who he meets. His vanity is his weakness. He believes he is untouchable. He keeps records of his conquests, deeds, contracts, letters. A man like that is proud of his crimes. He would keep proof of them. He was asking her to spy, to become a traitor in her own home, in her own marriage-to-be. The danger was immense. Thorne was not a man to be crossed. His cold grey eyes saw everything, and Mrs. Gable was his ever-present shadow. If he finds out, he will, Kyle said, the bluntness of it a slap in the face. If you are clumsy. But you are not clumsy, Rosalind. You are quiet. You are observant. They see you as a porcelain doll. They will not be looking for a viper. The comparison should have been insulting, but instead it sent a strange thrill of power through her. For weeks she had been nothing but a passive object. Kyle was the first person to see a strength in her she hadn't known she possessed. He saw a survivor. Before she could answer, the sound of a horse approaching from the main road sent a jolt of pure terror through her. Kyle's hand shot out, not touching her, but hovering near her arm in a silent command to be still. He melted back into the deep shadows of the cottonwoods, vanishing so completely it was as if he'd never been there at all. It was just one of Thorne's ranch hands riding back into town. He passed without a second glance. The danger was gone, but her heart was still racing. She was alone again by the creek, the hot wind rustling the dry leaves. Kyle's words echoed in her mind, layering over the memory of his declaration on Miller's Ridge. His fight was now her fight. Her gilded cage had a purpose. It was no longer just a prison. It was a battlefield. Returning to the silent, opulent house on the hill, she no longer felt like a victim. She felt like a spy. The decision to help Cale transformed Rosalind. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach, but it was now matched by a sharp, simmering sense of purpose. She began to move through Thorne's house with new eyes, seeing it not as her home, but as enemy territory. Every locked door, every guarded conversation, every ledger book in Thorne's study was a potential piece of the puzzle. She cultivated an air of demure listlessness, a fragility that made her seem utterly harmless. She would drift through the rooms, a book held limply in her hands, her expression one of mild melancholy. Mrs. Gable watched her with hawk-like suspicion, but saw only what she expected to see, a pampered, useless girl pining for a life she'd left behind. Thorne, engrossed in his business, saw a beautiful compliant fixture, the perfect future Mrs. Thorne. Neither of them saw the keen intelligence behind her downcast eyes, noting which key on Thorne's ring opened the study, memorizing the precise angle of the papers on his desk. The true nature of Bartholomew Thorne and the town he controlled was laid bare one blisteringly hot Tuesday. Rosalind was in the mercantile, enduring the fawning of the proprietor, when a commotion erupted in the street. She moved to the window, peering out between displays of canned goods and bolts of calico. A small group of Mexican farmers, their faces grim and streaked with dust, stood before the sheriff's office. They were led by an old man with a magnificent white mustache and a spine as straight as a rifle barrel, whose name she later learned was Mateo Vega. They were gesturing toward the parched hills, their voices rising in a mixture of Spanish and pleading English. Sheriff Brody stood on the boardwalk, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, a smirk on his face. Thorne appeared seemingly out of nowhere, his black suit immaculate against the dusty backdrop. He walked with an unhurried stride, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" Sheriff Thorne asked, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "Just the usual," Mr. Thorne Brody drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Vega's feet. "The Vegas claim their spring has run dry. They seem to think your new diversion dam up creek has something to do with it." "My dam is on my property," Thorne stated flatly. "It is a legal and necessary improvement for the health of my herds." "It starves our fields," Mateo Vega exclaimed, his voice cracking with passion. "That spring has fed our families for 3 generations. We have a right to that water, a right granted by the old treaty." Thorne's cold grey eyes settled on the old man. There was no anger in his gaze, only a profound, dismissive contempt. "Old treaties are scraps of paper. This territory operates under a new order. My order. I own the headwaters. I own the creek. I own the water. If you wish to purchase water for your gardens," he said the word with a sneer, "you may make an application at my office. The price is $5 a barrel." A collective gasp went through the small crowd of farmers. $5 a barrel was a death sentence. They could never afford it. It was a deliberate, calculated move to choke them out, to force them to abandon their land that Thorne would then undoubtedly acquire for a pittance. Mateo Vega took a defiant step forward. "You are a thief, sir. A common thief, hiding behind a silver star and a stack of paid-for laws." Sheriff Brody moved with surprising speed. He backhanded the old man across the face, sending him stumbling back into his sons. The crack of the blow echoed in the sudden, shocked silence of the street. "That's enough seditious talk," Old Man Brody growled, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Mr. Thorne is the founder and benefactor of this town. You'll show him respect." Rosalind watched, horrified, her hand flying to her mouth. This was not business. This was brutality. It was the naked, ugly face of the power that Cale had described. Thorne didn't even flinch. He simply watched, his expression unchanged, as if observing a ranch hand breaking a stubborn horse. He gave a curt nod to Brody, turned his back on the humiliated farmers, and walked away. The incident shattered any lingering illusions Rosalind had. This was not a man she could live with, whose name she could bear. He was a monster cloaked in civility. Her fear of him was now eclipsed by a burning, righteous hatred. She was no longer just helping Cale seek his personal revenge. She was fighting for the soul of this place and the lives of the people he was crushing under his heel. That night she waited until the entire house was dark and silent. She could hear the slow, steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, and the deep, rhythmic sound of Thorne's breathing from his bedroom down the hall. Her own heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Slipping out of her room, a single candle shielded in her hand, she crept down the grand staircase. She had observed that Thorne sometimes left his ring of keys on the hall table when he came in late. Tonight, by some miracle, they were there. Her fingers trembled as she found the small, ornate iron key she believed was for the study. The lock turned with an agonizingly loud click. She froze, listening, but the house remained silent. Inside the study, the air was thick with the scent of leather and cigar smoke. On his massive oak desk lay a leather-bound ledger. Her hands shook as she opened it. It wasn't a financial ledger. It was a logbook of his acquisitions. Page after page, detailed land purchases, water rights transfers, and mining claims. Alongside the official-looking entries were Thorne's own cryptic handwritten notes in the margins. Next to the entry for the Vega family's ancestral lands, purchased years ago after a sudden outbreak of cattle fever had wiped out their small herd, Thorne had written a single chilling phrase, a necessary inducement. Next to another parcel, the one Kyle had told her belonged to his grandfather, was a date of acquisition 2 days after the man's hunting accident, and a notation resolved by Brodie. Final. This was it. This was the proof. This was the cold black heart of Bartholomew Thorne, recorded in his own arrogant hand. He was not just a ruthless businessman. He was a conspirator, and likely a murderer with the town's only lawman as his paid accomplice. She couldn't take the ledger. Its absence would be noted immediately. Frantically, she searched the desk for a blank piece of paper and a pencil. With shaking hands, she began to copy the most damning entries, her heart pounding with each scratch of lead on paper. She copied the entry about Cale's grandfather, the one about the Vega's cattle, and a dozen others, each a small, cruel story of ruin. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Panic seized her. She shoved her copied notes into the bodice of her nightgown, closed the ledger, and placed it back in its exact position. After locking the door and replacing the keys, she flew up the stairs, her candle extinguished, praying the shadows would hide her. She slipped back into her room, just as she heard Mrs. Gable's door open down the hall. Huddled in her bed, the secret papers crinkling against her skin, Rosalind trembled not from fear, but from a terrible, newfound power. The silver star of redemption was tarnished with blood and greed, and she now held the evidence that could bring it all crashing down. The pages hidden in Rosalind's sewing box felt like burning embers. Their existence was a constant, terrifying secret that both empowered and endangered her. Every polite conversation with Thorne, every silent meal under the watchful eye of Mrs. Gable was a masquerade. She was living a double life, the demure fiancé on the surface and a co-conspirator in the shadows. She had to get the information to Cale. For 3 agonizing days, no opportunity presented itself. Thorne kept her close, taking her on a tour of a new mine shaft, where the workers looked at her with hollow, exhausted eyes. He seemed to be tightening his grip, reminding her of the scope of his power. Finally, her chance came. A circuit judge was arriving in 2 days, and Thorne was hosting a dinner party for him and the town's other influential figures. The house was thrown into a flurry of activity. Mrs. Gable was so consumed with polishing silver and directing the extra kitchen help that her surveillance of Rosalind became secondary. Rosalind feigned a headache, a common enough complaint for a delicate lady in the oppressive heat, and retired to her room. From her window, she watched the sun begin its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. When the long shadows stretched across the yard, she slipped out the back service door. She ran her fine day dress, snagging on sagebrush, her lungs burning. She followed the creek bed, the rendezvous point they had tacitly established during their last hurried meeting. The air grew cooler near the water, the scent of damp earth, a welcome relief from the town's dust. He was waiting for her, a silhouette against the fading light. He didn't speak as she approached, his amber eyes simply questioning. "I have it," she gasped, pulling the folded pages from her pocket. Proof, his own ledger, notes in his own hand, about your grandfather, about the Vegas, about so many others. Kyle took the papers, his long, deft fingers unfolding them. He read them in the dying light, his face a mask of stone. But Rosalind could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the pages. He was reading the clinical, dispassionate account of his family's destruction. When he finished, he looked up at her, and the raw fury in his eyes made her take a step back. It was the contained rage of a patient hunter who finally has his prey cornered. "This is more than I'd hoped for," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "This isn't just about land. This is conspiracy, murder." He refolded the pages with reverent care and tucked them inside his shirt. The circuit judge arrives the day after tomorrow. Thorne is hosting a dinner for him, Rosalind said. He wants to impress him, to show him what a civilized, orderly town Redemption has become under his guidance. A slow, predatory smile touched Kyle's lips. It did not reach his eyes. Then that is where it ends. Not in a dark alley or an ambush in the hills, but in his own house, in front of the men whose respect he craves. We will unmask him in his own throne room. They stood by the darkening creek and forged their plan. It was audacious, dangerous, and relied on perfect timing. Kyle would not act alone. He had allies, men from his mother's tribe who had been scattered by Thorne's greed, and Mexican families like the Vegas who had been pushed to the breaking point. They were not an army, but they were desperate, and they knew the land. Kyle's part was direct. He and his men would create a diversion, a fire at the old abandoned ore crusher at the far end of town. It would be big enough and loud enough to draw Sheriff Brody and any of Thorne's hired guns away from the house. Rosalind's part was far more subtle, and in many ways all dangerous. During the chaos, as the men at the dinner party were distracted, she would have to retrieve the original ledger from Thorne's study and present it to Judge Alistair Blackwood, the circuit judge. The copies were damning, but the ledger itself in Thorne's own hand was irrefutable. He will not be expecting the attack to come from within. Kyle said, his gaze locked on hers. He sees you as his most prized possession. The thought of your betrayal is beyond his comprehension. He reached out his calloused fingers, gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt of warmth and life against her skin. You are asking to be the tip of the spear, Rosalind. Once you do this, there is no going back. He will try to kill you. Let him try, she said, her voice filled with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The girl who had left Missouri willing to trade her life for her brother's security was gone. In her place was a woman who had seen true evil and had chosen to stand against it. Their covenant was sealed not with a handshake or a vow, but with a long, silent look. In his eyes, she saw the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine, a future forged in shadow and fire, free from gilded cages. In her eyes, he saw the unwavering resolve of an unexpected and formidable ally. "Be ready," he murmured, and then he was gone, dissolving into the twilight, leaving her alone with the sound of the creek and the weight of the coming reckoning. As she made her way back to the house, the first stars were appearing in the deep velvet of the desert sky. The lights of Thorne's mansion blazed on the hill, a beacon of false civility. She thought of the dinner party of the fine china and sparkling crystal that would soon be set. They were preparing for a celebration of power. They had no idea they were setting the stage for a revolution, and that she, the quiet, ornamental mail-order bride, would be the one to light the fuse. The night of the dinner party, the air in Thorne's house was thick with the scent of beeswax roasted lamb and expensive cologne. The guests had arrived Judge Alistair Blackwood, a stern-faced man with a formidable reputation for justice, the nervous banker Mr. Sterling, and a few other sycophants who orbited Thorne like pale moons. Bartholomew Thorne himself was in his element, holding court at the head of his gleaming dining table, a picture of magnanimity and power. Rosalind sat at the opposite end, playing her part to perfection. She wore a deep emerald silk gown Thorne had chosen for her. She smiled demurely, murmured polite responses, and kept her eyes downcast. But beneath the placid surface, her senses were screamingly alert. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a countdown. She watched Thorne through her lashes. He was pontificating about law and order, about the civilizing influence of strong leadership in the territories. Judge Blackwood listened, his expression neutral, occasionally asking a sharp, insightful question. Rosalind's palms were slick with sweat. The plan was a fragile thing, a house of cards that could be toppled by the slightest breeze of suspicion. Her greatest obstacle sat not at the table, but moved silently in the shadows along the walls, Mrs. Gable. The housekeeper's distrustful eyes seemed to miss nothing. At precisely 9 o'clock, a faint rhythmic sound began to drift in from the outside, a distant percussive beat. Thorne paused mid-sentence. "What is that noise?" he asked, annoyed by the interruption. Then a low orange glow began to flicker against the dining-room windows. A moment later, a man burst through the front door, one of Thorne's ranch hands, his face smudged with soot. "Fire, Mr. Thorne," he yelled. "The old ore crusher is ablaze. Looks like someone set it deliberately. There's drums, too. Riders. Indians, maybe?" Chaos erupted. The guests jumped to their feet. Sheriff Brody, who had been invited for dessert and whiskey, was instantly on his feet, his face red with a mixture of alarm and excitement. "I'll handle this," he bellowed, eager to prove his worth. "It's probably just some drunkards from the reservation. I'll round up a posse, and we'll put a stop to it." Thorne's face was a mask of cold fury. "See that you do, Sheriff. I will not have my town terrorized." As Brody and most of Thorne's men thundered out of the house and down the hill toward the growing blaze, Thorne turned to placate his guests. "A minor disturbance, gentlemen. Please let us retire to the study for brandy. My men will have it under control shortly." This was her moment. As the men moved toward the study, Rosalind feigned a swoon, pressing a hand to her forehead. "The smoke. I feel quite faint. I think I need some air." Thorne gave her an irritated glance. Mrs. Gable attended to Miss Hayes. It was the complication she had feared. As she stepped out onto the veranda, Mrs. Gable was right behind her, a grim shadow. "A glass of water, Miss? Yes, thank you," Rosalind said, leaning against the railing and breathing deeply. The distant shouts and the glow of the fire provided the perfect cover. As soon as the housekeeper turned to go back inside, Rosalind moved. She didn't go for the study key. She went for the one place she knew would be unguarded, Thorne's own bedroom. She had noticed weeks ago that he kept a second smaller ledger locked in a chest at the foot of his bed, a private journal, she suspected. It was a gamble. It might contain nothing. But the main ledger in the study was too obvious. The lock on the chest was simple. A hairpin from her elaborate hairstyle was all it took. Inside, beneath some personal papers, was a small black book. She flipped it open. It was his journal, and on the very first page, in his precise, arrogant script, he had written, "A private accounting of the necessary steps taken to secure my legacy in the Arizona Territory." It was a confession. It detailed everything: the bribes to land office officials, the intimidation of minors, the final resolution of Kyle's grandfather, even a note about how Sheriff Brody's loyalty was secured with silver and the knowledge of his own past crimes. A floorboard creaked behind her. Rosalind spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway, her face a pale, grim mask of accusation. "Thief," the housekeeper hissed. "I knew you were no good. I knew you were filth the moment I laid eyes on you." Before Rosalind could scream, Mrs. Gable lunged, her bony fingers clawing for the journal. They struggled a desperate, silent battle. Mrs. Gable was surprisingly strong, fueled by years of fanatical loyalty. She grabbed a heavy, silver-backed brush from Thorne's dresser and swung it. Rosalind ducked, and the brush smashed the mirror, the sound of shattering glass echoing like a gunshot. Suddenly the bedroom door flew open. It wasn't Thorne, it was Cale. His face was grimed with soot, his eyes blazing. He must have seen her enter the house. He moved with blinding speed, grabbing Mrs. Gable and pinning her arms behind her back. Rosalind, go now." Clutching the journal, Rosalind ran from the room down the stairs and burst into the study. The men were standing by the windows watching the fire. Thorne turned his face, contorting in rage at her intrusion. "What is the meaning of this? I told you to be silent," a voice commanded. It came not from Rosalind, but from Judge Blackwood. His eyes were fixed on the journal in her hand. "Young lady, what is that book?" "It's his confession." "Your Honor," Rosalind said, her voice shaking but clear. She opened it and thrust it at him. A record of his crimes: land theft, conspiracy, murder. Thorne's face went white. He took a step toward her, his hand raised. "You treacherous little—" I wouldn't, said Cale, appearing in the study doorway. In his hand was Sheriff Brody's pistol, taken no doubt from the lawman, amidst the chaos of the fire. Behind him, Mateo Vega and his 2 sons stood, their faces set and determined. The trap was sprung. Thorne was cornered. His guests stared at him, their faces a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. Judge Blackwood was reading the journal, his expression growing grimmer with every page. "Bartholomew Thorne," the judge said, his voice like the crack of doom. "These are your own words, your own hand. You have meticulously documented your own monstrous depravity." Thorne's composure finally shattered, his face twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. He lunged not at Cale, not at the judge, but at Rosalind. He was a wild animal aiming to destroy the source of his downfall. Cale fired the pistol. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. It wasn't aimed at Thorne's heart, but at his leg. Thorne screamed and collapsed, clutching his shattered knee. The reckoning was over. The King of Redemption had fallen in his own throne room, brought down by a mail-order bride he had mistaken for a trinket and a tracker. He had mistaken for a ghost. Silence descended on the study, broken only by Thorne's agonized moans and the distant dying crackle of the fire. The aftermath washed over Redemption like a cleansing flood. Judge Alistair Blackwood, a man of unbending integrity, acted swiftly. Thorne's journal was an irrefutable confession, and with it, the judge dismantled the corrupt empire. Thorne and a whimpering Sheriff Brody were taken into federal custody. Mrs. Gable's loyalty shattered, and her testimony sealed their fates. Redemption was reborn overnight. The cloud of fear lifted, and families like the Vegas began the legal process of reclaiming their stolen lands. Rosalind Hayes was no longer the mail-order bride, but the town's unlikely hero. She sent a letter to her brother Walter, along with enough money to secure the family farm, formally severing the last tie to her old life. The demure girl who left Missouri was gone, replaced by a woman who had stared down a tyrant and won. The thought of returning to that quiet, dusty existence was impossible. She found Cale on the ridge overlooking the valley where Thorne's mansion now stood, as a hollow monument to his greed. The sun was setting, painting the land in hues of gold and rose. "Will you go back?" Cale asked, his gaze on the horizon. "There's nothing for me there anymore," she said, turning to face him. "That life was chosen for me. This one, I want to choose for myself." He finally met her eyes, the old anger gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. "This is my home. There is much to rebuild." An unspoken question hung between them. They were from different worlds, an impossible match by any standard, but their own. "It will not be an easy life," he said, his voice low. "There will always be those who see only what divides us." "I'm no longer interested in what is easy," Rosalind replied, a small smile on her lips. "I'm interested in what is real." He reached out and took her hand. In that moment, she fully understood his words from so long ago. Mine. It was not a claim of ownership, but of recognition. He had seen the fighter in her all along. Standing on that ridge, they were not a mismatched pair, but two survivors who had forged their own justice. The dust of the old world had settled, and before them lay a new horizon they would face together on their own terms, free. The story of Rosalind and Kyle's journey through the dust and danger of the untamed West is a testament to the fact that destiny isn't something you accept. It's something you fight for. Their struggle reminds us that the strongest contracts are not written on paper, but are forged in the heart, and that true freedom is often found on the other side of our greatest fears. It's a story of courage, rebellion, and an unbreakable love that defied a world determined to keep them apart. If their incredible story resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle, please help us share more tales from the frontier. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with a friend who loves a classic Western with a modern soul. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel. Your support is what allows us to keep these forgotten legends of the Old West alive. Thank you for listening.